Today, Lindsey Graham pretty much gave us the blueprint of exactly how the United States is going to declare war on Iran. What he said was that Israel is going to basically go to war over the uranium enrichment that Iran is going to pursue. And after Israel goes to war, we're going to go and back up Israel. So this is some of what he has to say. It's a fairly long interview that he gave, and we're going to break this up into little pieces because he actually said quite a lot. So let's go ahead and get started.
Trump's not the problem, the Ayatollah is. This drone was in international waters.
International waters. So the drone was shot down in the Strait of Hormuz, which is, by the way, nowhere near the United States. So they're kind of making it sound like, if you watch the news and if you're reading the news, they make it sound like, Iran has acted very hostile towards the United States. They shot down one of our drones, acting like this drone was off the coast of California or off the coast of Florida. The United States has admitted to using this drone to spy on Iran. And Iran knows this, and so they shoot it down, knowing that it has nobody on board. And they said, we're sending you a message. Don't spy on us. We're shooting down your spy drone. And now we're apparently this is justifying us potentially going to war with Iran because we shot down a drone in the Strait of Hormuz, which is right next to Iran. I also want you to take a look at this map here, which shows all of the American bases that are surrounding Iran. Now, Iran has no bases surrounding the United States. We have been surrounding Iran. They have not been surrounding us. So I don't know who's more hostile in this situation, but we were there sending a drone spying. We've now surrounded them in bases, and yet they're the hostile actor. So he goes on to say this.
The president does not want a war with Iran or anybody else, but he is the commander-in-chief. And so when Abe was asked by the president, the prime minister of Japan, to deliver a message to the Iranians, let's talk, not only was he rebuffed, they attacked a Japanese ship while the Japanese prime minister is delivering a message from the American president, let's see if we can negotiate.
Okay, highly contested. We don't know if Iran actually attacked the Japanese nor the Norwegian ship. That is not something that we actually have proof of. That very well could have been the CIA, or it could have been Israel, for all we know, since we do know that Israel is the one that's going to end up marching us into war, as Lindsey Graham's about to tell us. So let's continue on here.
Here's the way this is headed. If they start enrichment at the levels they're talking about in a few days, Israel over time will have to respond. There's one nation on the planet that's not going to give the Iranians a pass on their nuclear program. That's Israel. Israel will, as a last resort, attack to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran. We will come to their aid.
As a last resort, he says. So he admits that, for one, Iran can, because we have no nuclear deal with them, remember? So the deal that we had with them was going to prevent them from enriching their uranium. Well, we tossed that deal out of the window a year ago, so they're free to do whatever they want. They still have a deal with Europe, but they announced to Europe on Monday that they were going to start their nuclear program again, that they were going to start amping up their uranium enrichment in 10 days from Monday. So now, we don't really have a reason to turn on them and say, you can't do this. And what's interesting about this is Israel was actually one of the main nations telling us, Israel and Saudi Arabia were the two nations that absolutely did not want a nuclear deal with Iran. They didn't want this deal. So now we don't have the deal. They got what they wanted. And now Iran is saying, okay, well, we have no deal, so I guess we can go ahead and up our enrichment of uranium. And now that is going to be cause somehow for Israel to go to war with Iran. And after Israel goes to war with Iran, we're going to be there to back them up. So you see, we don't have to be the bad guys in this. We don't actually have to be the ones to declare war. Israel will do it. And they're our allies, and we have to back them up. So that is how we're going to end up going to war with Iran. But he's not done. I want you to see more of these clips that he has because it's shocking and angering.
Here's what they're trying to do. They're trying to break our will, intimidate us to come to the negotiating table. The president made an offer to negotiate. The response was to attack a Japanese tanker, the emissary of the person chosen to deliver the offer. And last night they shot down a drone. So here's what Iran needs to get ready for. Severe pain inside their country. That their capabilities pale in comparison to ours. We're not going to let them disrupt navigation of the seas, attack our allies and U.S. interests without paying a price. So if they're itching for a fight, they're going to get one.
I don't know if they're the ones itching for the fight. I mean, we were, after all, using that drone to spy on them, and we have no evidence that they actually attacked those ships. In fact, it's way more likely, knowing the U.S.'s history, that we're the ones who did something to those ships, that it was either the CIA or it was Israel. It was some operative of ours that went and attacked those ships. It's way more likely, given the United States history. Now, that would be unfair to say if we didn't have the history we have of documents now that have been declassified proving that we have engaged in sabotage in order to go to war. But we have all of this information, decades worth of it. So we know that it's possible the United States is actually trying to provoke this war, trying to get enough so that the American people will be behind this war. That is what it's looking like, because obviously Israel wants to do it. And as soon as Israel goes, we're going to go. And we need to have a reason so that the American people aren't sitting there saying, but why? But why? Well, now they could say, well, but they've been attacking us and our allies. See, look what they did to this Japanese tanker. Look what they did to the Norwegian tanker. And look what they did to our drone. See? So he's not done.
If next week they go back into enrichment, putting them back on a path to a bomb, which they were on anyway, then that escalates the tension between Israel and Iran. If they do anything else against an American asset, and this president doesn't respond like Ronald Reagan, then that's a signal to North Korea and the entire world we're all talk.
So see what he's doing there. So he's trying to say that, well, if Trump does nothing about this, then the rest of the world is going to think we're weak, and he can't be weak. We can't be weak. And so he has to go to war. That is a really good way to talk someone into war. Is you say, you don't want to be perceived as a weak president, do you? No, you don't. We need to go to war. So see what he did there. He says, oh, well, North Korea will see it. Well, North Korea has already been ignoring us. They've already been testing their missiles and building nukes. So what is that going to show North Korea? That they're already not doing. They're already doing these things. So I don't, if anything, North Korea showed Iran what to do, not the other way around. So he continues.
You say the U.S. will aid Israel. Help people understand, what does that mean? U.S. military involvement?
100%. If they go back into the enrichment business, that puts them on an accelerated path to a bomb, and Israel has to defend itself against an existential threat, I am confident we will be there.
Okay, so he just said if Israel is needing to go to war, that we're going to be there. When she says, what does that mean? Help us understand, what does that mean? Does that mean basically backing up with war? And he says, yeah, that's exactly what that means.
I'm confident if there's a war with Iran, they lose.
Oh, he's confident that if there's a war with Iran, they would lose. I don't know where he gets his confidence, because I don't know what conflict we've gone in the last several years, decades, that has actually resulted in a win. The last time we tried to do something, several times that we've tried to do this, we have not left countries in better situations. We've lost. The Vietnam War comes to mind. And I got to say that if we were to go to war with Iran, it would be much more like the Vietnam War than it would be like any other engagement we've been in. And there is a big chance that we would not win, that Iran would slaughter our men and women that we send over there in droves. It would not be good. None of us want this. In fact, no one I know wants this. Even staunch conservatives, I talk to them, no one wants this war with Iran. It is simply Congress and the executive branch, the legislative branch and the executive branch, because they're in with the military-industrial complex. They're in with the oil companies. They're in with all of this, and they're the only ones that want this war. There are very, very few Americans who actually want this. But he goes on.
This is not an endless war. This is a provocative regime that's dismembered the Mideast, that shoots his own people down in the streets, that threatens the existence of the state of Israel. This is an enemy of mankind, and if you're not willing to take this enemy on, you'll regret it, because you're going to put all the pressure on Israel.
Okay, so there he goes to demonize Iran, saying this is an enemy of mankind. This is not going to be an endless war. But the thing about the last 40 years with Iran under the Ayatollah. Now, I am not a big fan of the Ayatollah. I'm not a big fan of the the way Iran has been run over the last 40 years at all, by any means. And they have been very provocative at times, just like we've been, just like many other nations have been. They're not alone in that. They have been provocative, but they're not alone. But I don't see Iran necessarily being this big, bad boogeyman that Lindsey Graham is trying to make them out to be, that they're an enemy to mankind. That's going pretty far. Now, you could definitely say that Iran and Israel have issues, and they have for the last 30 years, roughly. Maybe 35 years, they've had some real rough times. They've been really good friends. They went from allies to staunch enemies over the last 30, 40 years. So you could certainly say that there's been a threat to Israel. Israel has, the two nations have definitely been at each other's throats, to say the least. There's been a lot of really ramped up rhetoric between the two nations. There was, Iran is run by, the Ayatollah is a religious figure. And so they did, after the Ayatollah took power, took on a more religious tone in their nation. They were a secular state, and then they became religious. And in doing that, they demonized a lot of others that were, Jews and Christians and anybody else. And they really wanted to kind of run their nation under Sharia law of some sort. Or Islamic law. I'm not too familiar if there's a difference between that, so I apologize. I don't get all my facts right. And I do want to mention, by the way, in my last video, I did make a mistake. I did put a correction, but some of you didn't see it. And it was about Sunni Muslims versus Shia Muslims. And I did make the I said that Sunni Muslims were the minority and Shia Muslims were the majority, and that is not true. Sunni Muslims are the vast majority of Muslims around the world. Shia Muslims, which happen to be the majority in Iran, are actually the minority of Muslims around the world. So Iran is Shia Muslim. Saudi Arabia is Sunni Muslim. It's different. So, but I don't know if Iran, maybe you don't like them. Maybe you don't like that they have a religious nation. I know I certainly don't like that. I think any religion that rules a nation is going to be oppressive. But I don't know if I would call Iran an enemy to mankind. I mean, that's going a bit far.
Here's what I believe about Donald Trump. He's a deal maker. He's trying to avoid conflict. But this is truly a defining moment for him.
Who else participating?
When Obama said to Assad, you better not use chemical weapons, Assad did. The rest is history. Trump has told the Iranians, you cannot disrupt navigation of the seas, you can't attack our interests or our allies. That's an unacceptable way to live in the 21st century. They are testing him. They need to do so at their own peril. If they get away with this, God help us with North Korea and throughout the world. I'm convinced that as a last resort, President Trump will stop this behavior.
So, he's saying that as a last resort, which is not true. This is not a last resort. Iran is not threatening the United States. They're not coming after us at all. They're not threatening our sovereignty. They're not threatening our safety. They're just wanting to be left alone. Now, they're wanting to potentially begin building nukes. I would think that is absolutely what Iran is wanting to do. There's very few nuclear nations in the world. Iran would like to become one of them, because why wouldn't you want to become one of them? When the nuclear nations are able to threaten you and strong-arm you and bully you, you want to become one so that you can't be threatened and bullied and strong-armed anymore. So of course nations like Iran, of course nations like North Korea want their own nuclear arsenal. Of course they do. I don't blame them. Do I think it's a good idea for every nation in the world to have a nuke? No, I don't think any of us should have nukes. It's extremely dangerous, and nukes can get into the hands of madmen, including American madmen. It's not just madmen from around the world. Oh, it's just the Middle Eastern madmen or just those Asian madmen. No, we potentially have a madman in the White House right now. So I don't think any of us should have nukes. So I understand this feeling of, we don't want them to have them either. But I could also understand why Iran would say, yeah, but we want them because you have them. So why wouldn't we want to be equally armed?
The president is going to monitor enrichment before deciding to take military action?
I'm saying that if they increase enrichment standards, that Israel will begin to change their calculation. So 95% is what you need to get to a bomb. The difference between 3.5 and 20 is big. From 20 to 95 is like walking across the street.
Who else does he have the right advisors, sir, without a SecDef?
Yeah, I don't think it's the lack of a SecDef problem. I think the problem is we're trying to find a way to deal with a rogue regime who's a expeditionary force for evil, and were being tested. And here's what I do believe. They know that they will lose. They just don't believe yet that we have the will to fight back.
I don't think Iran knows 100% that they're going to lose, not with the United States history going into various nations and engaging. We don't really have a great history of winning. The last one that I can think we really won was World War II. And we weren't alone on that fight. So I don't know if Iran is sitting there thinking, oh, we're definitely going to lose, because anytime the United States goes and marches itself somewhere, they absolutely destroy the place and win every single time. That's not the case. So I don't think Iran is thinking that. Now, after watching this, there's two big questions. And the first big question I sort of already answered, which is, what is the beef between Israel and Iran? Because if Israel is going to be the ones marching to war with Iran, why would that even be? Well, it's because the two nations, they have some serious history between them over the last 35, 40 years. A lot of rhetoric. Iran has been very much in the wrong at times, and so is Israel. Iran has been quite provocative against Israel. I'm not going to lie about it. So they have really, ultimately, what it boils down to is this, in trying to sum up the real issue, is that prior to the Ayatollah and the revolution in Iran in 1979, the Shah was very much a Western buddy. And I talk about this in a previous video, but the Shah was very much pro-Western. And obviously with us having an alliance with Israel, that makes you also pro-Israel. Well, when the Ayatollah took over, the Iranian people, when they did the revolution, they were very disillusioned with the United States. They felt like their king, the Shah, was very much in the pocket of the United States and doing the United States bidding. They felt like they wanted to run their own nation, not the CIA, which is understandable. So when the Ayatollah came in, the people were very much like, all right, get rid of the United States. Anything that has to do with America and Americans, we want it gone. We want to get rid of it. Well, part of that was, and which is why there was the Iranian hostage crisis and why we've had bad relations with Iran for these last 40 years. But part of that was also Israel. So they saw Israel as the proxy for the United States. So they hated the United States. They were angry with the United States, and they saw Israel as the nation in the Middle East doing the bidding for the U.S. So they also turned on Israel. That's ultimately what happened. So since then, Iran has had bad relations with the United States and poor relations, beyond poor relations with Israel. They've called for the destruction of Israel. They have funded some terrorist organizations against Israel. It's been pretty bad. In the same token, Israel has done things to Iran. They've assassinated some Iranian scientists. It's been a real battle between the two nations. Now, Israel is very worried about Iran getting nuclear weapons, because Israel doesn't want Iran to have any sort of stronghold on Israel. Now, the two nations don't share a border. They don't really have any territorial issues, but they do have this ideological issue, and Iran has an issue with Israel simply because Israel's been the United States proxy in the Middle East, which is, I think, undisputed. So Iran, in the meantime, has, buddied up with Syria, for example, and had lots of bases, military bases in Syria, which is right on the Israeli border. So there's a lot of contention and there's a lot of conflict there. And because of it, Israel's very freaked out about Iran. Iran is freaked out about the United States and Israel, and it's not looking good. So with all of that, Israel is... Now, they are the nation, as Lindsey Graham said, they're the only nation on earth that is willing to engage first. And that is just true. Israel is one of the beefs that many of us have with Israel, and with especially Netanyahu's Israel, is that they just engage. They don't wait to defend themselves. They engage first a lot of times. Or when they are defending themselves, they go way overboard and commit humanitarian crimes. So, with this, Lindsey Graham just said, Israel's the only nation in the world that when Iran starts building up their uranium, that Israel's going to say, that's it, we're coming after you. Even if Iran is not saying anything to Israel, if they're not saying, look, you're at risk, we're going to get you. Even if Iran's like, look, we just want our own nukes to keep our own nation protected. We want to be able to defend ourselves. Even if that's what Iran says, Israel doesn't care. They're going to go after them. They're very proactive. They don't wait to defend. Like I said, they're very proactive. So That is what Lindsey Graham is saying. They're going to just go after him. They're going to do our dirty work. That is one of the big reasons. The second question you would have is, why do we have such a strong alliance with Israel? Well, the biggest reason why we have such an alliance with Israel is because they are willing to kind of be the pit bull. They're willing to go around and aggressively do the dirty work that the United States government is unable to talk the American people into. But if you can get Israel to do it, and we're allies with Israel, and we have an allegiance with them, that if they go to war, we go to war with them, then it's a lot easier to engage in conflict when you can send Israel to do your dirty work. Not only that, but they're willing to do a lot of other dirty work. They just really don't have as many boundaries as the United States has or the American people have. So that is really where we're at with this. But Lindsey Graham gave us the blueprint of exactly how the United States is going to be declaring war with Iran. We're not going to have to do it. We're not going to have to wait for them to blow up another ship, supposedly, or down a drone off of their coast that was spying on them. We're not going to have to wait for these things to declare war. We're just going to let Israel do it. And after they do it, we'll be right behind them. If you like this channel, please subscribe. I do appreciate your support. Also, you can support this channel by donating to my PayPal or my Patreon. I often get demonetized when I talk about war and terror and try to keep you educated on these things. So it is something that I'm aware of. I'm trying to figure out ways in the future that I might be able to keep my channel safe so that I can continue to give you the truth about what's going on. But in the meantime, I do appreciate all of your support. And just even if you're watching these videos through, I appreciate that so much because I do a lot of research for them. So thank you so much.